Chapter 34. A Turn of the Screw. "Now what," says Mr. George, "may this be? Is it a blank cartridge or ball? A flash in the pan, or a shot?" An open letter is the subject of the trooper's speculations, and it seems to perplex him mightily. He looks at it at arm's length, brings it close to him, holds it in his right hand, holds it in his left hand, reads it with his head on this side, with his head on that side, contracts his eyebrows, elevates them, still cannot satisfy himself. He smooths it out upon the table with his heavy palm, and thoughtfully walking up and down the gallery, makes a halt before it every now and then to come upon it with a fresh eye. Even that won't do. Is it, Mr. George still muses, blank cartridge or ball? Phil's squad, with the aid of a brush and paint pot, is employed in the distance whitening the targets, softly whispering in a quick march time and in a drum and fife manner that he must and will go back to the girl he left behind him. Phil, the trooper beckons as he calls him. Phil approaches in his usual way, sidling off at first as if he were going anywhere else, and then bearing down upon his commander like a bayonet charge. Certain splashes of white show in high relief upon his dirty face, and he scrapes his one eyebrow with the handle of the brush. "Attention, Phil, listen to this." "Steady, Commander, steady." "Sir, allow me to remind you, though there is no legal necessity for my doing so, as you are aware, that the bill at 2 months' stake drawn on yourself by Mr. Matthew Bagnet, and by you accepted, for the sum of £97 4s. 9d, will become due to-morrow, when you will please to be prepared to take up the same on presentation. Yours, Joshua Smallweed." "What do you make of that, Phil?" "Mischief, governor." "Why?" "I think," replies Phil, after pensively tracing out a cross wrinkle in his forehead with the brush handle, "that mischievous consequences is always meant when money's asked for." "Look'ee, Phil," says the trooper, sitting on the table, "first and last I have paid, I may say, half as much again as this principal and interest, and one thing and another." Phil intimates by sidling back a pace or two, with a very unaccountable wrench of his wry face, that he does not regard the transaction as being made more promising by this incident. "And looking further, Phil," says the trooper, staying his premature conclusions with a wave of his hand, "there's always been an understanding that this bill was to be what they call renewed, and it has been renewed no end of times. What do you say now?" "I say that I think the time has come to an end at last." "You do? I'm much of the same mind myself." "Joshua Smallweed is him what was brought here in a chair?" "The same." "Governor," says Phil with exceeding gravity, "he is a leech in his dispositions. He is a screw and a vice in his actions, a snake in his twistings, and a lobster in his claws." Having thus expressively entered his sentiments, Mr. Squad, after waiting a little to ascertain if any further remark be expected of him, gets back by his usual series of movements to the target he has in hand, and vigorously signifies through his former musical medium that he must and he will return to the ideal young lady. George, having folded the letter, walks in that direction. "There is a way, Commander," says Phil, looking cunningly at him, "of settling this." "Paying the money, I suppose. I wish I could." Phil shakes his head. "No, governor, no, not so bad as that. There is a way," says Phil, with a highly artistic turn of his brush. "What I'm a doing at the present. Whitewashing." Phil nods. "A pretty way that would be. Do you know what would become of the Bagnets in that case? Do you know they would be ruined to pay off my old scores?" "You're a moral character," says the trooper, eyeing him in his large way, with no small indignation. "Upon my life you are, Phil." Phil, on one knee at the target, is of course protesting earnestly, though not without many allegorical scoops of his brush and smoothings of the white surface round the rim of his thumb, that he had forgotten the Bagnet responsibility would not so much injure a hair of the head of any member of that worthy family, when steps are audible in the long passage without, and a cheerful voice is heard to wonder whether George is at home. Phil, with a look at his master, hobbles up, saying, "Here's the governor, Mrs. Bagnet. Here he is." And the old girl herself, accompanied by Mr. Bagnet, appears. The old girl never appears in walking trim in any season of the year without a grey cloth coat, coarse and much worn but very clean, which is undoubtedly the identical garment rendered so interesting to Mr. Bagnet by having made its way home to Europe from another quarter of the globe, with Mrs. Bagnet and an umbrella. The latter faithful appendage is also invariably a part of the old girl's presence out of doors. It is of no colour known in this life, and has a corrugated wooden crook for a handle, with a metallic object let into its prow, or beak, resembling a little model of a fanlight over a street door, or one of the oval glasses out of a pair of spectacles, which ornamental object has not that tenacious capacity of sticking to its post that might be desired in an article long associated with the British Army. The old girl's umbrella is of a flabby habit of waist, and seems to be in need of stays, an appearance that is possibly referable to its having served through a series of years at home as a cupboard, and on journeys as a carpet bag. She never puts it up, having the greatest reliance on her well-proved cloak with its capacious hood, but generally uses the instrument as a wand with which to point out joints of meat or bunches of greens in marketing, or to arrest the attention of tradesmen by a friendly poke. Without her market basket, which is a sort of wicker well with two flapping lids, she never stirs abroad. Attended by these, her trusty companions, therefore, her honest sunburnt face looking cheerily out of a rough straw bonnet, Mrs. Bagnet now arrives, fresh-coloured and bright, in George's shooting gallery. "Well, George, old fellow," says she, "how do you do this sunshiny morning?" Giving him a friendly shake of the hand, Mrs. Bagnet draws a long breath after her walk, and sits down to enjoy a rest. Having a faculty matured on the tops of baggage waggons, and in other such positions of resting easily anywhere, she perches on a rough bench, unties her bonnet strings, pushes back her bonnet, crosses her arms, and looks perfectly comfortable. Mr. Bagnet, in the meantime, has shaken hands with his old comrade, and with Phil, on whom Mrs. Bagnet likewise bestows a good-humoured nod and a smile. "Now, George," says Mrs. Bagnet briskly, "here we are, Lignum and myself." She often speaks of her husband by this appellation, on account, as it is supposed, of lignum vitae having been his old regimental nickname when they first became acquainted, in compliment to the extreme hardness and toughness of his physiognomy. "Just looked in, we have, to make it all correct as usual about that security. Give him the new bill to sign, George, and he'll sign it like a man." "I was coming to you this morning," observes the trooper reluctantly. "Yes, we thought you'd come to us this morning, but we turned out early and left Woolwich, the best of boys, to mind his sisters, and came to you instead, as you see, for Lignum, he's tied so close now and gets so little exercise that a walk does him good. But what's the matter, George?" asked Mrs. Bagnet, stopping in her cheerful talk. "You don't look yourself." "I'm not quite myself," returns the trooper. "I've been a little put out, Mrs. Bagnet." Her bright quick eye catches the truth directly. "George," holding up her forefinger, "don't tell me there's anything wrong about that security of Lignum's. Don't do it, George, on account of the children." The trooper looks at her with a troubled visage. "George," says Mrs. Bagnet, using both her arms for emphasis and occasionally bringing down her open hands upon her knees, "if you have allowed anything wrong to come to that security of Lignum's, and if you have let him in for it, and if you put us in danger of being sold up, and I see sold up in your face, George, as plain as print, you've done a shameful action, and have deceived us cruelly. I tell you cruelly, George, there." Mr. Bagnet, otherwise as immovable as a pump or a lamp post, puts his large right hand on the top of his bald head, as if to defend it from a shower bath, and looks with great uneasiness at Mrs. Bagnet. "George," says that old girl, "I wonder at you, George. I'm ashamed of you, George. I couldn't have believed you would have done it. I always knew you to be a rolling stone that gathered no moss, but I never thought you would have taken away what little moss there was for Bagnet and the children to lie upon. You know what a hard-working, steady-going chap he is. You know what Quebec and Malta and Woolwich are, and I never did think you would or could have had the heart to serve us so. Oh, George!" Mrs. Bagnet gathers up her cloak to wipe her eyes in a very genuine manner. "How could you do it?" Mrs. Bagnet ceasing, Mr. Bagnet removes his hand from his head as if the shower bath were over, and looks disconsolately at Mr. George, who has turned quite white and looks distressfully at the grey cloak and straw bonnet. "Matt," says the trooper in a subdued voice, addressing him but still looking at his wife, "I'm sorry you take it so much to heart, because I do hope it's not so bad as that it comes to. I certainly have this morning received this letter," which he reads aloud, "but I hope it may be set right yet. As to a rolling stone, why, what you say is true. I am a rolling stone, and I never rolled in anybody's way. I fully believe that I rolled the least good to. But it's impossible for an old vagabond comrade to like your wife and family better than I like 'em, Matt, and I trust you'll look upon me as forgivingly as you can. Don't think I've kept anything from you. I haven't had the letter more than quarter of an hour." "Old girl," murmurs Mr. Bagnet after a short silence, "will you tell him my opinion?" "Oh, why didn't he marry," Mrs. Bagnet answers, half laughing and half crying, "Joe Pouch's widder in North America? Then he wouldn't have got himself into these troubles." "The old girl," says Mr. Bagnet, "puts it correct. Why didn't you?" "Well, she has a better husband by this time, I hope," returns the trooper. "Anyway, here I stand this present day, not married to Joe Pouch's widder. What shall I do? You see, all I have got about me, it's not mine, it's yours. Give the word, and I'll sell off every morsel. If I could have hoped it would have brought in nearly the sum wanted, I'd have sold all long ago. Don't believe that I'll leave you or yours in the lurch, Matt. I'd sell myself first. I only wish," says the trooper, giving himself a disparaging blow in the chest, "that I knew of any one who'd buy such a second-hand piece of old stores." "Old girl," murmurs Mr. Bagnet, "give him another bit of my mind." "George," says the old girl, "you are not so much to be blamed on full consideration, except for ever taking this business without the means." "And that was like me," observes the penitent trooper, shaking his head. "Like me, I know." "Silence. The old girl," says Mr. Bagnet, "is correct in her way of giving my opinions. Hear me out. That was when you never ought to have asked for the security, George, and when you never ought to have got it, all things considered. But what's done can't be undone. You're always an honourable and straightforward fellow as far as it lays in your power, though a little flighty. On the other hand, you can't admit but what it's natural in us to be anxious with such a thing hanging over our heads. So forget and forgive all round, George. Come, forget and forgive all round." Mrs. Bagnet giving him one of her honest hands, and giving her husband the other, Mr. George gives each one of them one of his, and holds them while he speaks. "I do assure you both there's nothing I wouldn't do to discharge this obligation, but whatever I have been able to scrape together has gone every 2 months in keeping it up. We've all lived plainly enough here, Phil and I, but the gallery don't quite do what is expected of it, and it's not, in short, it's not the mint. It was wrong in me to take it. Well, so it was, but I was in a manner drawn to that step, and I thought it might steady me and set me up, and you'll try to overlook my having such expectations, and upon my soul I'm very much obliged to you, and very much ashamed of myself." With these concluding words, Mr. George gives a shake to each of the hands he holds, and relinquishing them, backs a pace or two in a broad-chested, upright attitude, as if he had made a final confession, and were immediately going to be shot with all military honours. "George, hear me out," says Mr. Bagnet, glancing at his wife. "Old girl, go on." Mr. Bagnet, being in this singular manner heard out, has merely to observe that the letter must be attended to without any delay, that it is advisable that George and he should immediately wait on Mr. Smallweed in person, and that the primary object is to save and hold harmless Mr. Bagnet, who had none of the money. Mr. George, entirely assenting, puts on his hat and prepares to march with Mr. Bagnet to the enemy's camp. "Don't you mind a woman's hasty word, George," says Mrs. Bagnet, patting him on the shoulder. "I trust my old Lignum to you, and I'm quite sure you'll bring him through it." The trooper returns that this is kindly said, and that he will bring Lignum through it somehow. Upon which Mrs. Bagnet, with her cloak, basket, and umbrella, goes home bright-eyed again, to the rest of her family, and the comrades sally forth on the hopeful errand of mollifying Mr. Smallweed. Whether there are two people in England less likely to come satisfactorily out of any negotiation with Mr. Smallweed than Mr. George and Mr. Matthew Bagnet may be very reasonably questioned. Also, notwithstanding their martial appearance, broad square shoulders, and heavy tread, whether there are within the same limits two more simple and unaccustomed children in the small-weedy affairs of life. As they proceed with great gravity through the streets towards the region of Mount Pleasant, Mr. Bagnet, observing his companion to be thoughtful, considers it a friendly part to refer to Mrs. Bagnet's late Sally. "George, you know the old girl. She's as sweet and mild as milk, but touch her on the children or myself, and she's off like gunpowder. It does her credit, Matt. George," says Mr. Bagnet, looking straight before him, "the old girl can't do anything that don't do her credit. More or less, I never say so. Discipline must be maintained." "She's worth her weight in gold," says the trooper. "In gold?" says Mr. Bagnet. "I'll tell you what, the old girl's weight is 12 stone 6. Would I take that weight in any metal for the old girl? No. Why not? Because the old girl's metal is far more precious than the preciousest metal, and she's all metal." "You're right, Matt. When she took me and accepted of the ring, she listed under me and the children, heart and head for life. She's that earnest," says Mr. Bagnet, "and true to her colours, that touch us with a finger and she turns out and stands to her arms. If the old girl fires wide once in a way at the call of duty, look over it, George, for she's loyal." "Why, bless her, Matt," returns the trooper, "I think the higher of her for it." "You're right," says Mr. Bagnet, with the warmest enthusiasm, though without relaxing the rigidity of a single muscle. "Think as high of the old girl as the Rock of Gibraltar, and you'd still be thinking low of such merits. But I never owned to it before her. Discipline must be maintained." These encomiums bring them to Mount Pleasant and to Grandfather Smallweed's house. The door is opened by the perennial Judy, who, having surveyed them from top to toe with no particular favour, but indeed with a malignant sneer, leaves them standing there while she consults the oracle as to their admission. The oracle may be inferred to give consent from the circumstance of her returning with the words on her honey lips that they can come in if they want to it. Thus privileged they come in, and find Mr. Smallweed with his feet in the drawer of his chair, as if it were a paper footbath, and Mrs. Smallweed obscured with the cushion, like a bird that is not to sing. "My dear friend," says Grandfather Smallweed, with those two lean, affectionate arms of his stretched forth, "how do you do? How do you do? Who is our friend, my dear friend?" "Why, this," returns George, not able to be very conciliatory at first, "is Matthew Bagnet, who has obliged me in that matter of ours, you know." "Oh, Mr. Bagnet, surely!" The old man looks at him under his hand. "Hope you're well, Mr. Bagnet. Fine man, Mr. George. Military air, sir." No chairs being offered, Mr. George brings one forward for Bagnet and one for himself. They sit down, Mr. Bagnet as if he had no power of bending himself, except at the hips, for that purpose. "Judy," says Mr. Smallweed, "bring the pipe." "Well, I don't know," Mr. George interposes, "that the young woman need give herself that trouble, for to tell you the truth, I'm not inclined to smoke it to-day." "Ain't you?" returns the old man. "Judy, bring the pipe." "The fact is, Mr. Smallweed," proceeds George, "that I find myself in rather an unpleasant state of mind. It appears to me, sir, that your friend in the city has been playing tricks." "Oh dear no," says Grandfather Smallweed, "he never does that." "Don't he? Well, I'm glad to hear it, because I thought he might be his doing. This, you know, I am speaking of this letter." Grandfather Smallweed smiles in a very ugly way in recognition of the letter. "What does it mean?" asks Mr. George. "Judy," says the old man, "have you got the pipe? Give it to me. Did you say what does it mean, my good friend?" "Ay, come on now, you know, Mr. Smallweed," urges the trooper, constraining himself to speak as smoothly and confidentially as he can, holding the open letter in one hand and resting the broad knuckles of the other on his thigh. "A good lot of money has passed between us, and we are face to face at the present moment, and are both well aware of the understanding there has always been. I am prepared to do the usual thing, which I have done regularly, and to keep this matter going. I never got a letter like this from you before, and I've been a little put out by it this morning, because here's my friend Matthew Bagnet, who you know had none of the money." "I don't know it, you know," says the old man quietly. "Why, confound you, I tell you so, don't I?" "Oh yes, you tell me so," returns Grandfather Smallweed, "but I don't know it." "Well," says the trooper, swallowing his fire, "I know it." Mr. Smallweed replies with excellent temper, "Ah, that's quite another thing," and adds, "But it don't matter, Mr. Bagnet's situation is all one, whether or no." The unfortunate George makes a great effort to arrange the affair comfortably, and to propitiate Mr. Smallweed by taking him upon his own terms. "That's just what I mean, as you say, Mr. Smallweed. Here's Matthew Bagnet, liable to be fixed, whether or no. And now, you see, that makes his good lady very uneasy in her mind, and me too. For whereas I'm a harum-scarum sort of a good-for-naught that more kicks than halfpence come natural to, why, he's a steady family man, don't you see now, Mr. Smallweed?" says the trooper, gaining confidence as he proceeds in his soldierly mode of doing business. "Although you and I are good friends enough in a certain sort of a way, I am well aware that I can't ask you to let my friend Bagnet off entirely." "Oh dear, you are too modest. You can ask me anything, Mr. George." There is an ogreish kind of jocularity in Grandfather Smallweed to-day. "And you could refuse, you mean, eh? Not you so much, perhaps your friend in the city." "Ha, ha!" echoes Grandfather Smallweed in such a very hard manner, and with eyes so particularly green, that Mr. Bagnet's natural gravity is much deepened by the contemplation of that venerable man. "Come," says the sanguine George, "I'm glad to find we can be pleasant, because I want to arrange this pleasantly. Here's my friend Bagnet, and here am I. We'll settle the matter on the spot, if you please, Mr. Smallweed, in the usual way, and you'll ease my friend Bagnet's mind and his family's mind a good deal, if you'll just mention to him what our understanding is." Here some shrill spectre cries out in a mocking manner, "Oh, good gracious, oh!" unless indeed it be the sportive Judy, who is found to be silent when the startled visitors look round, but whose chin has received a recent toss expressive of derision and contempt. Mr. Bagnet's gravity becomes yet more profound. "But I think you asked me, Mr. George." Old Smallweed, who had all this time had the pipe in his hand, is the speaker now. "I think you asked me what did the letter mean?" "Why, yes, I did," returns the trooper in his offhand way, "but I don't care to know particularly, if it's all correct and pleasant." "That's what it means, my dear friend. I'll smash you, I'll crumble you, I'll powder you. Go to the devil." The two friends rise and look at one another. Mr. Bagnet's gravity has now attained its profoundest point. "Go to the devil," repeats the old man. "I'll have no more of your pipe smokings and swaggerings. What? You're an independent dragoon too. Go to my lawyer. You remember where. You've been there before. And show your independence now, will you? Come, my dear friend, there's a chance for you. Open the street door, Judy. Put these blusterers out. Call in help if they don't go. Put 'em out." He vociferates this so loudly that Mr. Bagnet, laying his hands on the shoulders of his comrade before the latter can recover from his amazement, and gets him on the outside of the street door, which is instantly slammed by the triumphant Judy. Utterly confounded, Mr. George awhile stands looking at the knocker. Mr. Bagnet, in a perfect abyss of gravity, walks up and down before the little parlour window like a sentry, and looks in every time he passes, apparently revolving something in his mind. "Come, Matt," says Mr. George, when he has recovered himself, "we must try the lawyer now. What do you think of this rascal?" Mr. Bagnet, stopping to take a farewell look into the parlour, replies with one shake of his head, directed at the interior, "If my old girl had been here, I'd have told him." Having so discharged himself on the subject of his cogitations, he falls into step and marches off with the trooper, shoulder to shoulder. When they present themselves at Lincoln's Inn Fields, Mr. Tulkinghorn is engaged and not to be seen. He is not at all willing to see them, for when they have waited a full hour, and the clerk with his bell being rung takes the opportunity of mentioning as much, he brings forth no more encouraging message than that Mr. Tulkinghorn has nothing to say to them, and they had better not wait. They do wait, however, with the perseverance of military tactics, and at last the bell rings again, and the client in possession comes out of Mr. Tulkinghorn's room. The client is a handsome old lady, no other than Mrs. Rouncewell, housekeeper at Chesney Wold. She comes out of the sanctuary with a fair old-fashioned curtsy, and softly shuts the door. She is treated with some distinction there, for the clerk steps out of his pew to show her through the outer office and let her out. The old lady is thanking him for his attention when she observes the comrades in waiting. "I beg your pardon, sir, but I think those gentlemen are military." The clerk, referring to the question of him in his eye, and Mr. George not turning round from the almanac over the fireplace, Mr. Bagnet takes it upon himself to reply, "Yes, ma'am, formally." "I thought so. I was sure of it. My heart warms, gentlemen, at the sight of you. It always does at the sight of such. God bless you, gentlemen. You'll excuse an old woman, but I had a son once who went for a soldier. A fine, handsome youth he was, and good in his bold way, though some people did disparage him to his poor mother. I ask your pardon for troubling you, sir. God bless you, gentlemen." "Same to you, ma'am," returns Mr. Bagnet with a right good will. There is something very touching in the earnestness of the old lady's voice, and in the tremble that goes through her quaint old figure. But Mr. George is so occupied with the almanac over the fireplace, calculating the coming months by it perhaps, that he does not look round until she has gone away, and the door is closed upon her. "George," Mr. Bagnet gruffly whispers, as he does turn from the almanac at last, "don't be cast down. Why, soldiers, why should we be melancholy, boys? Cheer up, my hearty." The clerk having now gone in to say that they are still there, and Mr. Tulkinghorn being heard to return with some irascibility, "Let 'em come in, then." They pass into the great room in the painted ceiling, and find him standing before the fire. "Now, you men, what do you want, Sergeant? I told you the last time I saw you that I don't desire your company here." Sergeant replies, dashed within the last few minutes as to his usual manner of speech, and even to his usual carriage, that he has received this letter, has been to see Mr. Smallweed about it, and has been referred there. "I have nothing to say to you," rejoins Mr. Tulkinghorn. "If you get into debt, you must pay your debts or take the consequences. You have no occasion to come here to learn that, I suppose." Sergeant is sorry to say that he is not prepared with the money. "Very well, then. The other man, this man, if that is he, must pay it for you." Sergeant is sorry to add that the other man is not prepared with the money either. "Very well, then. You must pay it between you, or you both must be sued for it, and both suffer. You have the money and must refund it. You are not to pocket other people's pounds, shillings, and pence, and escape scot-free." The lawyer sits down in his easy chair and stirs the fire. Mr. George hopes he will have the goodness to. "I tell you, Sergeant, I have nothing to say to you. I don't like your associates, and I don't want you here. This matter is not at all in my course of practice, and is not my office. Mr. Smallweed is good enough to offer these affairs to me, but they are not in my way. You must go to Melchisedec's in Clifford's Inn." "I must make an apology to you, sir," says Mr. George, "for pressing myself upon you with so little encouragement, which is almost as unpleasant to me as it can be to you. But would you let me say a private word to you?" Mr. Tulkinghorn rises with his hands in his pockets and walks into one of the window recesses. Now I have no time to waste. In the midst of his perfect assumption of indifference, he directs a sharp look at the trooper, taking care to stand with his own back to the light, to have the other with his face towards it. "Well, sir," says Mr. George, "this man with me is the other party implicated in this unfortunate affair. Nominally, only nominally, and my sole subject is to prevent his getting into trouble on my account. He is a most respectable man with a wife and family, formerly in the Royal Artillery. My friend, I don't care a pinch of snuff for the whole Royal Artillery establishment, officers, men, tumbrils, waggons, horses, guns, and ammunition. 'Tis likely, sir, but I care a good deal for Bagnet and his wife and family being injured on my account, and if I could bring them through this matter, I should have no help for it but to give up, without any other consideration, what you wanted of me the other day." "Have you got it here?" "I have got it here, sir." "Sergeant," the lawyer proceeds in his dry, passionless manner, far more hopeless in the dealing with than any amount of vehemence, "make up your mind while I speak to you, for this is final. After I have finished speaking, I have closed the subject, and I won't reopen it. Understand that? You can leave here for a few days what you say you have brought here, if you choose. You can take it away at once, if you choose. In case you choose to leave it here, I can do this for you. I can replace this matter on its old footing, and I can go so far besides as to give you a written undertaking that this man Bagnet shall never be troubled in any way until you have been proceeded against to the utmost, that your means shall be exhausted before the creditor looks to his. This is, in fact, all but freeing him. Have you decided?" The trooper puts his hand into his breast and answers with a long breath, "I must do it, sir." So Mr. Tulkinghorn, putting on his spectacles, sits down and writes the undertaking, which he slowly reads and explains to Bagnet, who has all this time been staring at the ceiling, and who puts his hand on his bald head again under this new verbal shower bath, and seems exceedingly in need of the old girl, through whom to express his sentiments. The trooper then takes from his breast pocket a folded paper, which he lays with an unwilling hand at the lawyer's elbow. "'Tis only a letter of instruction, sir, the last I ever had from him. Look at a millstone, Mr. George, for some change in its expression, and you will find it quite as soon as in the face of Mr. Tulkinghorn when he opens and reads the letter. He refolds it and lays it in his desk with a countenance as unperturbable as death. Nor has he anything more to say or do but to nod once in the same frigid and discourteous manner, and to say briefly, 'You can go. Show these men out there.' Being shown out, they repair to Mr. Bagnet's residence to dine. Boiled beef and greens constitute the day's variety on the former repast of boiled pork and greens, and Mrs. Bagnet serves out the meal in the same way, and seasons it with the best of temper, being that rare sort of old girl that she receives good to her arms without a hint that it might be better, and catches light from any little spot of darkness near her. The spot on this occasion is the darkened brow of Mr. George. He is unusually thoughtful and depressed. At first Mrs. Bagnet trusts to the combined endearments of Quebec and Malta to restore him, but finding those young ladies sensible their existing Bluffy is not the Bluffy of their usual frolicsome acquaintance, she winks off the light infantry and leaves him to deploy at leisure on the open ground of the domestic hearth. But he does not. He remains in close order, clouded and depressed. During the lengthy cleaning up and pattening process, when he and Mr. Bagnet are supplied with their pipes, he is no better than he was at dinner. He forgets to smoke, looks at the fire and ponders, lets his pipe out, fills the breast of Mr. Bagnet with perturbation and dismay by showing that he has no enjoyment of tobacco. Therefore, when Mrs. Bagnet at last appears, rosy from the invigorating pail, and sits down to do her work, Mr. Bagnet growls, "Old girl," and winks monitions to her to find out what's the matter. "Why, George," says Mrs. Bagnet, quietly threading a needle, "how low you are!" "Am I? Not good company. Well, I'm afraid I'm not." "He ain't at all like Bluffy, mother," cries little Malta. "Because he ain't well, I think, mother," adds Quebec. "Sure that's a bad sign not to be like Bluffy too," returns the trooper, kissing the young damsels. "But it's true," with a sigh, "true, I'm afraid. These little ones are always right." "George," says Mrs. Bagnet, working busily, "if I thought you'd cross enough to think of anything than a shrill old soldier's wife, who could have bitten her tongue off afterwards, and ought to have done it almost, said this morning, I don't know what I shouldn't say to you now." "My kind soul of a darling," returns the trooper, "not a morsel of it. Because really and truly, George, what I said and meant to say was that I trusted Lignum to you, and was sure you'd bring him in through it. And you have brought him through it. Noble!" "Thank you, my dear," says George. "I'm glad of your good opinion." In giving Mrs. Bagnet's hand with her work in it a friendly shake, for she took her seat beside him, the trooper's attention is attracted to her face. After looking at it for a little while as she plies her needle, he looks to young Woolwich sitting on his stool in the corner, and beckons that fifer to him. "See there, my boy," says George, very gently smoothing the mother's hair with his hand. "There's a good loving forehead for you, all bright with love of you, my boy. A little touched by the sun and the weather through the following your father about and taking care of you, but as fresh and wholesome as a ripe apple on a tree." Mrs. Bagnet's face expresses, so far as in its wooden material lies, the highest approbation and acquiescence. "Time will come, my boy," pursues the trooper, "when this hair of your mother's will be grey, and this forehead all crossed and recrossed with wrinkles, and a fine old lady she'll be then. Take care while you are young that you can think in those days. I never whitened a hair of a dear head. I never marked a sorrowful line in her face. For of all the many things that you can think of when you are a man, you had better have that by you, Woolwich." Mr. George concludes by rising from his chair, seating the boy beside his mother in it, and saying, with something of a hurry about him, that he'll smoke his pipe in the street a bit. Chapter 35. Esther's narrative. I lay ill through several weeks, and the usual tenor of my life became like an old remembrance. But this was not the effect of time so much as of the change in all my habits made by the helplessness and inaction of a sick room. Before I had been confined to it many days, everything else seems to have retired into a remote distance, where there was little or no separation between the various stages of my life, which had been really divided by years. In falling ill, I seemed to have crossed a dark lake, and to have left all my experiences mingled together by the great distance on the healthy shore. My housekeeping duties, though at first it caused me great anxiety to think they were underperformed, were soon as far off as the oldest of the old duties at Greenleaf, or the summer afternoons when I went home from school with my portfolio under my arm, and my childish shadow at my side, to my godmother's house. I had never known before how short life really was, and into how small a space the mind could put it. While I was very ill, the way in which these divisions of time became confused with one another distressed my mind exceedingly. Once a child, an elder girl, and the little woman I had been so happy as, I was not only oppressed by cares and difficulties adapted to each station, but by the great perplexity of endlessly trying to reconcile them. I suppose that few who have not been in such a condition can quite understand what I mean, or what painful unrest arose from this source. For the same reason I am almost afraid to hint. At that time in my disorder it seemed one long night, but I believe there were both nights and days in it, when I laboured up a colossal staircase, ever striving to reach the top, and ever turned, as I have seen a worm in a garden path, by some obstruction, and labouring again. I knew perfectly of intervals, and I think vaguely at most times, that I was in my bed, and I talked with Charlie, and felt her touch, and knew her very well. Yet I would find myself complaining, "Oh, more of these never-ending stairs, Charlie, more and more piled into the sky," I think, and labouring on again. Dare I hint at that worst time when, strung together somewhere in a great black space, there was a flaming necklace or ring or starry circle of some kind, of which I was one of the beads, and when my only prayer was to be taken off from the rest, and when it was such an inexplicable agony and misery to be part of the dreadful thing? Perhaps the less I say of these sick experiences, the less tedious and the more intelligible I shall be. I do not recall them to make others unhappy, or because I am now the least unhappy of remembering them. It may be that if we knew more of such strange afflictions, we might be the better to alleviate their intensity. The repose that succeeded the long delicious sleep, the blissful rest when in my weakness I was too calm to have any care for myself, and could have heard, or so I think now, that I was dying, with no other emotion than with a pitying love for those who I left behind. This state can perhaps more widely understood. I was in this state when I first shrunk from the light, as it twinkled on me once more, and I knew with boundless joy, for which no words are rapturous enough, that I should see again. I had heard my Ada crying at the door day and night. I had heard her calling to me that I was cruel and did not love her. I had heard her praying and imploring to be let in to nurse and comfort me, and to leave my bedside no more. But I had only said when I could speak, "Never, my sweet girl, never." And I had over and over again reminded Charlie that she was to keep my darling from the room whether I lived or died. Charlie had been true to me in that time of need, and with her little hand and her great heart had kept the door fast. But now, my sight strengthening, and the glorious light coming in every day more fully and brightly on me, I could read the letters that my dear wrote to me every morning and evening, and could put them to my lips and lay my cheek upon them with no fear of hurting her. I could see my little maid, so tender and so careful, going about 2 rooms, setting everything in order, and speaking cheerfully to Ada from the open window again. I could understand the stillness of the house and the thoughtfulness it expressed on the part of all those who had always been so good to me. I could weep in the exquisite felicity of my heart, and be as happy in my weakness as I ever had been in my strength. By and by my strength began to be restored. Instead of lying with so strange a calmness, watching what was done for me, as if it were done for someone else whom I was quietly sorry for, I helped a little, and so on to a little more, and much more, until I became useful to myself, and interested and attached to life again. How well I remember the pleasant afternoon when I was raised in bed, with pillows, for the first time, to enjoy a great tea drinking with Charlie, the little creature sent into the world surely to minister to the weak and sick, was so happy and so busy, and stopped so often in her preparations to lay her head upon my bosom, and fondle me and cry with joyful tears, that she was so glad that I was obliged to say, "Charlie, if you go on in this way, I must lie down again, my darling, for I am weaker than I thought I was." So Charlie became as quiet as a mouse, and took her bright face here and there across the 2 rooms, out of the shade into the divine sunshine, and put of the sunshine into the shade, while I watched her peacefully. When all her preparations were concluded, and the pretty tea table with its little delicacies to tempt me, and its white cloth and its flowers, and everything so lovingly and beautifully arranged for me by Ada downstairs, was ready for the bedside, I felt sure I was steady enough to say something to Charlie that was not new to my thoughts. First I complimented Charlie on the room, and indeed it was so fresh and airy, so spotless and neat, that I could scarce believe I had been lying there so long. This delighted Charlie, and her face was brighter than before. "Yet, Charlie," said I, looking round. Poor little Charlie looked round too, and pretended to shake her head as if there were nothing absent. "Are the pictures all as they used to be?" I asked her. "Every one of them, miss," said Charlie. "And the furniture, Charlie?" "Except where I've moved it about to make more room, miss." "And yet," said I miss some familiar object. Ah, I know what it is, Charlie. It's the looking glass." Charlie got up from the table, making as if she had forgotten something, and went into the next room, and I heard her sob there. I had thought of this very often. I was now certain of it. I can thank God that it was not a shock to me now. I called Charlie back, and when she came, at first pretending to smile, but as she drew nearer to me, looking grieved, I took her in my arms and said, "It matters very little, Charlie. I hope I can do without my old face very well." I was presently so far advanced as to be able to sit up in the great chair, and even to giddily walk into the adjoining room, leaning on Charlie. The mirror was gone from its usual place in that room too, but what I had to bear was none the harder to bear for that. My guardian had throughout been earnest to visit me, and there was now no good reason why I should deny myself that happiness. He came one morning, and when he first came in could only hold me in his embrace and say, "My dear, dear girl." I had long known, who could know better, what a deep fountain of affection and generosity his heart was, and it was not worth my trivial suffering and change to fill such a place in it. Oh yes, I thought, he has seen me, and he loves me better than he did. He has seen me, and is even fonder of me than he was before, and what do I have to mourn for? He sat down by me on the sofa, supporting me with his arm. For a little while he sat with his hand over his face, but when he removed it, fell into his usual manner. There never can be a pleasanter manner. "My little woman," said he, "what a sad time this has been. Such an inflexible little woman too, through all." "Only for the best, guardian," said I. "For the best," he repeated tenderly. "Of course, for the best. But here Ada and I have been perfectly forlorn and miserable. Here has your friend Caddy been coming and going late and early, and here has every one about the house been utterly lost and dejected.
Here has even poor Rick been writing to me, too, in his anxiety for you. I have read of Caddy and Ada's letters, but not of Richard, and I told him so. Why, no, my dear, he replied. I have thought it better not to mention it to her. And you speak of his writing to you, said I, repeating his emphasis, as if it were not natural for him to do so, guardian, as if he could write to a better friend. He thinks he could, my love, returned my guardian, and to many a better. The truth is, he wrote to me under a sort of protest, while unable to write to you with any hope of an answer. Wrote coldly, haughtily, distantly, resentfully. Well, dearest little woman, we must look forbearingly on it. He is not to blame. Jarndyce and Jarndyce has warped him out of himself and perverted me in his eyes. I have known it to do as bad deeds and worse many a time. If two angels could be concerned in it, I believe it would change their nature. It has not changed yours, guardian. Oh, yes, it has, my dear, he said laughingly. It has made the south wind easterly. I don't know how often. Rick mistrusts and suspects me. He goes to lawyers and is taught to mistrust and suspect. Hears I have conflicting interests, claims clashing against his, and what not. Whereas heaven knows that if I could get out of the mountains of wigglomeration on which my unfortunate name has been so long bestowed, which I can't, or could level them by the extinction of my own original right, which I can't either, and no human power ever can, I believe to such a pass we have got, I would do it this hour. I would rather restore to poor Rick his proper nature than be endowed with all the money that dead suitors, broken heart and soul upon the wheel of Chancery, have left unclaimed with the Accountant General. And that's money enough, my dear, to be cast into a pyramid in memory of Chancery's transcendent wickedness. Is it possible, guardian, I asked amazed, that Richard can be suspicious of you? Ah, my love, he said, it is in the subtle poison of such abuses to breed such diseases. His blood is infected, and objects lose their natural aspects in his sight. It is not his fault. But it is a terrible misfortune, guardian. It is a terrible misfortune, little woman, to be ever drawn with the influences of Jarndyce and Jarndyce. I know none greater. By little and little he has been induced to trust in that rotten reed, and it communicates some portion of its rottenness to everything around him. But again I say with all my soul, we must be patient with poor Rick, and not blame him. What a troop of fine fresh hearts like his I have seen in my time turned by the same means. I could not help expressing something of my wonder and regret that his benevolent, disinterested intentions had prospered so little. We must not say so, Dame Durden, he cheerfully replied. Ada is the happier, I hope, and that is much. I did think that I and both these young creatures might be friends instead of distrustful foes, and that we might so far counteract the suit and prove too strong for it. But it was too much to expect. Jarndyce and Jarndyce was the curtain of Rick's cradle. But, guardian, may we not hope that a little experience will teach him what a false and wretched thing it is, and that it may not teach him too late? In any case, we must not be hard on him. There are not many grown and matured men living while we speak, good men too, who, if they were thrown into this same court as suitors, would not be vitally changed and depreciated within 3 years. Within 2, within 1. How can we stand amazed at poor Rick, a young man so unfortunate? And here he fell into a lower tone as if he were thinking aloud. Cannot at first believe, who could, that Chancery is what it is. He looks to it, flushed and fitfully, to do something with his interests and bring them to some settlement. It procrastinates, disappoints, tries, tortures him, wears out his sanguine hopes and patience, thread by thread. But still he looks to it and hankers after it, and finds his whole world treacherous and hollow. Well, enough of this, my dear. He had supported me, as at first, all this time, and his tenderness was so precious to me that I leaned my head upon his shoulder and loved him as if he had been my father. I resolved in my own mind in this little pause by some means to see Richard when I grew strong, and try to set him right. There are better subjects than these, said my guardian, for such a joyful time as the time of our dear girl's recovery, and I had a commission to broach one of them as soon as I should begin to talk. When shall Ada come to see you, my love? I had been thinking of that too, a little in connection with the absent mirrors, but not much, for I knew my loving girl would be changed by no change in my looks. Dear guardian, said I, as I have shut her out so long, indeed she is like the light to me. I know it well, Dame Durden, well. He was so good, his touch expressed such endearing compassion and affection, and the tone of his voice carried such comfort into my heart, that I stopped for a little while, quite unable to go on. Yes, yes, you are tired, said he. Rest a little. As I have kept Ada out so long, I began afresh after a short while, I think I should like to have my own way a little longer, guardian. It would be best to be away from here before I see her. If Charlie and I were to go to some country lodging as soon as I could move, and if I had a week there in which to grow stronger, to be revived by the sweet air, and to look forward to the happiness of having Ada with me again, I think it would be better for us. I hope it was not a poor thing in me to wish to be a little more used to my altered self before I met the eyes of the dear girl I longed so ardently to see. But it is the truth, I did. He understood me, I was sure, but I was not afraid of that. If it were a poor thing, I knew he would pass it over. Our spoilt little woman, said my guardian, shall have her own way, even in her inflexibility, though at the price, I know, of tears downstairs. And see here is Boythorn, heart of chivalry, breathing such ferocious vows as never were breathed on paper before. And if you don't go and occupy his whole house, he having already turned out of it expressly for that purpose, by heaven and by earth, he'll pull it down and not leave one brick standing on another. As my guardian put a letter in my hand, without any ordinary beginning, such as my dear Jarndyce, but rushing at once into the words, I swear if Miss Summerson do not come down and take possession of my house, which I vacate for her this day at 1 p.m., and then with the utmost seriousness and in the most emphatic terms, going on to make the extraordinary declaration he had quoted. We did not appreciate the writer the less for laughing heartily over it, and we settled that I should send him a letter of thanks on the morrow and accept his offer. It was a most agreeable one to me, for all the places I could have thought of, I should have liked to have gone none so well as Chesney Wold. Now, little housewife, said my guardian, looking at his watch, I was strictly timed before I came upstairs, for you must not be tired too soon, and my time has waned away to the last minute. I have one other petition. Little Miss Flite, hearing a rumour that you were ill, made nothing of walking down here 20 miles, poor soul, in a pair of dancing shoes, to inquire. It was heaven's mercy we were at home, or she would have walked back again. The old conspiracy to make me happy. Everybody seemed to be in it. Now, pet, said my guardian, if it would not be irksome to you to admit this harmless little creature one afternoon before you save Boythorn's otherwise devoted house from demolition, I believe you would make her prouder and better pleased with herself than I, though my eminent name is Jarndyce, could do in a lifetime. I have no doubt he knew there would be something in the simple image of the poor afflicted creature that would fall like gentle reason on my mind at that time. I felt it as he had spoke to me. I could not tell him heartily enough how ready I was to receive her. I had always pitied her, never so much as now. I had always been glad of my little power to soothe her under her calamity, but never, never half so glad before. We arranged a time for Miss Flite to come out by coach and share my early dinner. When my guardian left me, I turned my face away upon my couch and prayed to be forgiven if I had, surrounded by such blessings, had magnified to myself the little trial that I had to undergo. The childish prayer of that old birthday, when I had aspired to be industrious, contented, and true-hearted, and to do good to some one and win some love to myself if I could, came back into my mind, with a reproachful sense of all the happiness I had since enjoyed, and all the affectionate hearts that had been turned towards me. If I were weak now, what had I profited by those mercies? I repeated the old childish prayer in its old childish words, and found that its old peace had not departed from it.
My guardian now came every day. In a week or so more I could walk about our rooms and hold long talks with Ada from behind the window curtain. Yet I never saw her, for I had not as yet the courage to look at the dear face, though I could have done so easily without her seeing me. On the appointed day Miss Flite arrived. The poor little creature ran into my room quite forgetful of her usual dignity, and crying from her very heart of hearts, "My dear Fitz Jarndyce," fell upon my neck and kissed me 20 times. "Dear me," said she, putting her hand into her reticule, "I have nothing here but documents, my dear Fitz Jarndyce. I must borrow a pocket handkerchief." Charlie gave her one, and the good creature certainly made use of it, for she held it to her eyes with both hands, and sat so, shedding tears for the next 10 minutes. "With pleasure, my dear Fitz Jarndyce," she was careful to explain. "Not the least pain. Pleasure to see you well again. Pleasure at having the honour of being admitted to see you. I am so much fonder of you, my love, than of the Chancellor, though I do attend court regularly. By the by, my dear, mentioning pocket handkerchiefs." Miss Flite here looked at Charlie, who had been to meet her at the place where the coach stopped. Charlie glanced at me and looked unwilling to pursue the suggestion. "Very right," said Miss Flite. "Very correct. Truly, highly indiscreet of me to mention it. But, my dear Miss Fitz Jarndyce, I am afraid I am at times, between ourselves, you wouldn't think it, a little rambling, you know." And Miss Flite, touching her forehead, "Nothing more." "What were you going to tell me?" said I, smiling, for I saw she wanted to go on. "You have roused my curiosity, and now you must gratify it." Miss Flite looked at Charlie for advice in this important crisis, who said, "If you please, ma'am, you'd better tell then," and therein gratified Miss Flite beyond measure. "So sagacious, our young friend," said she to me in a mysterious way. "Diminutive, but very sagacious. Well, my dear, it's a pretty anecdote, nothing more. Still, I think it charming. Who should follow us on down the road from the coach, my dear, but a poor person in a very ungenteel bonnet." "Jenny, if you please, miss," said Charlie. "Just so," Miss Flite acquiesced with the greatest gravity. "Jenny, yes. And does she tell our young friend but there has been a lady with a veil inquiring at her cottage after my dear Fitz Jarndyce's health, and taking a handkerchief away with her as a little keepsake, merely because it was my amiable Fitz Jarndyce's? Now you know, so very prepossessing in the lady with the veil." "If you please, miss," said Charlie, to whom I looked in some astonishment, "Jenny says that when her baby died you left a handkerchief there, and she put it away and kept it with the baby's little things. I think, if you please, partly because it was yours, miss, partly because it had covered the baby." "Diminutive," whispered Miss Flite, making a variety of motions about her own forehead to express intellect in Charlie, "but exceedingly sagacious. And so, dear, my love, she's clearer than any counsel I ever heard." "Yes, Charlie," I returned, "I remember it well." "Well, miss," said Charlie, "and that's the handkerchief the lady took. And Jenny wants you to know that she wouldn't have made away with it herself for a heap of money, but that the lady took it and left some money instead. Jenny don't know her at all, if you please, miss." "Why, who can she be?" said I. "My love," Miss Flite suggested, advancing her lips to my ear with her most mysterious look, "in my opinion, don't mention this to our diminutive friend, she is the Lord Chancellor's wife. He's married, you know, and I understand she leads him a terrible life. Throws his lordship's papers into the fire, my dear, and he won't pay the jeweller." I did not think very much about this lady then, for I had an impression that it might be Caddy. Besides, my attention was diverted by my visitor, who was cold after her ride and looked hungry, and who, our dinner being brought in, required some little assistance in arraying herself with great satisfaction in a pitiable old scarf and a much worn and often mended pair of gloves, which she had brought down in a paper parcel. I had to preside too over the entertainment. Dish of fish, a roast fowl, a sweetbread, vegetables, pudding, Madeira, and it was so pleasant to see how she enjoyed it, and with what state and ceremony she did honour to it, that I was soon thinking of nothing else. When we had finished and had our little dessert before us, embellished by the hands of my dear, who would yield the superintendence of everything prepared for me to no one,
Miss Flite was so very chatty and happy that I thought I would lead her to her own history, as she was always pleased to talk about herself. I began by saying, "You've attended on the Lord Chancellor many years, Miss Flite." "Oh, many, many, many years, my dear. But I expect a judgment shortly." There was an anxiety, even in her hopefulness, that made me doubtful if I had done right in approaching the subject. I thought I would say no more about it. "My father expected a judgment," said Miss Flite. "My brother, my sister, they all expected a judgment, the same that I expect. They are all—" "Yes, dead, of course, my dear," said she. As I saw she would go on, I thought it best to try to be serviceable to her by meeting the theme rather than avoiding it. "Would it not be wiser," said I, "to expect this judgment no more?" "Why, my dear," she answered promptly, "of course it would." "And to attend the court no more?" "Equally, of course," said she. "Very wearing always to be in expectation of what never comes, my dear Fitzjarndyce. Wearing, I assure you, to the bone." She slightly showed me her arm, and it was fearfully thin indeed. "But, my dear," she went on in her mysterious way, "there's a dreadful attraction in the place. Hush! Don't mention it to our diminutive friend when she comes in, or it may frighten her. With good reason. There's a cruel attraction in the place. You can't leave it, and you must expect." I tried to assure her this was not so. She heard me patiently and smilingly, but was ready with her own answer. "Ay, ay, ay! You think so because I'm a little rambling. Very absurd to be a little rambling, is it not? Very confusing, too. To the head I find it so. But, my dear, I have been there many years, and I have noticed it is the mason's seal upon the table." "What could they do, did she think?" I mildly asked her. "Draw," returned Miss Flite. "Draw people on, my dear. Draw peace out of them, sense out of them, good looks out of them, good qualities out of them. I have felt them even drawing my rest away in the night. Cold and glittering devils." She tapped me several times upon the arm, and nodded good humouredly as if she were anxious I should understand that I had no cause to fear her, though she spoke so gloomily and confided these awful secrets to me. "Let me see," said she. "I'll tell you my own case. Before they ever drew me, before I had ever seen them, what was it I used to do? Tambourine playing? No, tambour work. I and my sister worked at tambour work. Our father and our dear brother had a builder's business. We all lived together, very respectably, my dear. First our father was drawn, slowly. Home was drawn with him. In a few years he was a fierce, sour, angry bankrupt, without a kind word or a kind look for anyone. He had been so different, Fitzjarndyce. He was drawn to a debtor's prison. There he died. Then our brother was drawn swiftly to drunkenness and rags and death. Then my sister was drawn. Hush! Never ask to what. Then I was ill and in misery, and heard, as I had often heard before, that this was all the work of Chancery. When I got better I went to look at the monster, and then I found out how it was, and I was drawn to stay there." Having got over a short narrative, in the delivery of which she had spoken in a low, strained voice, as if the shock were fresh upon her, she gradually resumed her usual air of amiable importance. "You don't quite credit me, my dear. Well, well, you will some day. I am a little rambling, but I have noticed, I have seen many new faces come, unsuspicious, within the influence of the mace and seal in these many years, as my father's came there, as my brother's, as my sister's, as my own. I hear Conversation Kenge and the rest of them say to the new faces, 'Here's little Miss Flite. Oh, you are new here. You must come and be presented to little Miss Flite. Very good. Proud I am, sure to have the honour.' And we all laugh. But, Fitzjarndyce, I know what will happen. I know far better than they do when the attraction has begun. I know the signs, my dear. I saw them beginning gridley, and I saw them end. Fitzjarndyce, my love," speaking low again, "I saw them beginning in our friend in the ward in Jarndyce. Let some one hold him back, or he will be drawn to ruin." She looked at me in silence for some moments, with her face gradually softening into a smile, seeming to fear that she had been too gloomy, and seeming also to lose the connection in her mind. She said politely, as she sipped her glass of wine, "Yes, my dear, as I was saying, I expect a judgment shortly. Then I shall release my birds, and confer estates." I was much impressed by her allusion to Richard, and by the sad meaning so sadly illustrated in her poor pinched form, that it made its way through all her incoherence. But happily for her, she was quite complacent again now, and beamed with nods and smiles. "But, my dear," she said gaily, reaching another hand to put it upon mine, "you have not congratulated me on my physician. Positively not once yet." I was obliged to confess that I did not quite know what she meant. "My physician, Mr. Woodcourt, my dear, who was so exceedingly attentive to me, though his services were rendered quite gratuitously, until the day of judgment. I mean the judgment that will dissolve the spell upon me of the mace and seal." "Mr. Woodcourt is so far away now," said I. "I thought that the time for such congratulation was past, Miss Flite." "But, my child," she returned, "is it possible that you don't know what has happened?" "No," said I. "Not what everybody has been talking of, my beloved Fitz Jarndyce?" "No," said I. "You forget how long I have been here." "True, my dear, for the moment, true. I blame myself, but my memory has been drawn out of me with everything else by what I mentioned. Very strong influence, is it not? Well, my dear, there's been a terrible shipwreck over in those East Indian seas." "Mr. Woodcourt shipwrecked?" "Don't be agitated, my dear. He is safe. An awful scene. Death in all shapes. Hundreds of dead and dying. Fire, storm, and darkness. Numbers of the drowning thrown upon a rock. There, and through it all, my dear physician was a hero, calm and brave through everything. Saved many lives. Never complained in hunger and thirst. Wrapped naked people in his spare clothes. Took the lead and showed them what to do. Governed them. Tended the sick. Buried the dead. And brought the poor survivors safely off at last. My dear, the poor emaciated creatures all but worshipped him. They fell down at his feet when they had got to the land and blessed him. The whole country rings with it. Stay, where's my bag of documents? I've got it there, and you shall read it. You shall read it." And I did read all the noble history, but very slowly and imperfectly then, for my eyes were so dimmed that I could not see the words, and I cried so much that I was many times obliged to lay down the long account she had cut out of the newspaper. I felt so triumphant ever to have known the man who had done such generous and gallant deeds. I felt such glowing exultation in his renown. I so admired and loved what he had done that I envied the storm-worn people who had fallen at his feet and blessed him as their preserver. I could myself have kneeled down then, so far away, and blessed him in my rapture that he should be so truly good and brave. I felt that no one, mother, sister, wife, could honour him more than I. I did, indeed. My poor little visitor made me a present of the account, and when, as the evening began to close in, she rose to take her leave, lest she should miss the coach by which she was to return, she was still full of the shipwreck, which I had not sufficiently composed myself to understand in all its details. "My dear," said she, as she carefully folded up her scarf and gloves, "my brave physician ought to have a title bestowed upon him, and no doubt he will. Are you of that opinion?" "That he well deserved one, yes. That he would ever have one, no." "Why not, Fitz Jarndyce?" she asked rather sharply. I said it was not the custom in England to confer titles on men distinguished by peaceful services, however good and great, unless occasionally when they consisted of the accumulation of some very large amount of money. "Why, good gracious," said Miss Flite, "how can you say that? Surely you know, my dear, that all the greatest ornaments of England, in knowledge, imagination, active humanity, and improvement of every sort, are added to its nobility. Look around you, my dear, and consider. You must be rambling a little now, I think, if you don't know that this is a great reason why titles will always last in the land." I am afraid she believed what she said, for there were moments when she was very mad indeed. And now I must part with the little secret I have thus far tried to keep. I had thought sometimes that Mr. Woodcourt loved me, that if he had been richer he would have perhaps told me that he loved me before he went away. I had thought sometimes that if he had done so, I should have been glad of it. But how much better it was now that this had never happened. What should I have suffered if I had to write to him and tell him that the poor face he had known as mine was quite gone from me, and that I freely released him from his bondage to one whom he had never seen? Oh, it was so much better as it was, with the great pang mercifully spared me. I could take back to my heart my childish prayer to be all he had so brightly shown himself, and there was nothing to be undone, no chain for me to break or for him to drag, and I could go, please God, my lowly way along the path of duty, and he could go his nobler way upon its broader road. And though we were apart upon the journey, I might aspire to meet him unselfishly, innocently, better far than he had thought me when I found some favour in his eyes at journey's end.